Okay, just to thank the North Cork for the invitation today. I always feel it's actually nice to get out of Dublin, even though I don't live in Dublin, but I work, and it seems like all roads lead to Dublin. But sometimes, you know, there are other roads and other journeys, and I think it's really important that you know, the work that's happening in Cork and further afield is recognised. So I just want to firstly just acknowledge the work of North Cork, and I think that introduction was lovely, just in terms of, you know, the incredible work that you're doing and how you're doing that in limited resources. And I think there's a real appreciation of what's happening at a very grassroots level. And I do admire, you know, the incredible work of the primary healthcare programme in terms of community development engagement. But I do also want to maybe just talk a little bit about the report, and I have it here, and it's lovely again to see it in the hard copy. And I'll take that and probably a few more with me today. But it is important, because they're trying to replicate or say what's already been said. Like the traveller community we are one of the most vulnerable, most discriminated groups in our society. It's not something that we take joy in having to say again and again and again, but it is a fact, and it's a fact that we have to live that life in terms of how people treat us. But that also comes into question, because we tend to also engage more and more with public services. So therefore, that engagement or that interaction with mainstream service that are not designed to meet our specific cultural needs as a community. So we actually don't have any key involvement in decision making or the process of how a service is actually provided. And we tend to come in a bit later in terms of the cultural competency. But in terms of looking at this, in terms of the introduction of the public sector, I think when it did come in 2014, I can actually recall it, and I just feel that there's a level of confidence that, you know, something's going to shift or change, and we might see an improvement at the time. But when you talk to people on the ground, and when you look at what actually materialised, 8 years later, very little or nothing has actually changed. And I suppose that's a bit of an enlightenment in terms of the public sector duty in itself, and how it didn't have the teeth to actually monitor and carry out more, the teeth to actually monitor, but also in terms of how the public sector duty would be actually applied and implemented. So that was just a downfall in terms of that, in terms of what we would have anticipated. And in saying that, as somebody who was probably one of many at the time who engaged in a campaign for the equality legislation, and I can give my years away, but I was actively involved in the campaign for the equality legislation, which under that was to protect a number of key groups, including the traveller community. So travellers are protected. However, you might say, well, to what protection, or how is that going to demonstrate it? But again, it relates to public sector duty, because we are named as a group that should be protected, and therefore there's an onus and responsibility in the public sector to ensure or enshrine that in terms of their work, in terms of their actions, in terms of monitoring, and in terms of having oversight. And again, that's not evident. That's not evident. And it's not evident in terms of, when you look at broader, in terms of even an audit, and how just as a snapshot of, you know, a particular area. But when you look at a national level, there is no audit, there is no indicators, there is no monitoring. And I think that is you know, an area that this report has highlighted and needs to be progressed in terms of at a national level. So when you're looking at this, the audit is the public sector across all public bodies, and it is about gathering data, gathering information, and also in terms of an ethnic identifier. So currently, if you access any particular service, a lot of services don't gather you don't gather information in terms of ethnicity. And really, you can't really plan really well if you don't do that, if you don't do it to start with. And it's not just about people accessing services, it's actually about populations or people who might access certain services but not others. So it's not just about accessing the service itself, but it's also about how that service is actually delivered and who is delivered for and how. So there is a key action within that in terms of the Human Rights and Equality Commission, and in terms of taking a national audit. But there's also other key actions within that, and I think every report, if you get in behind the terminology, the language, you might say, well, you know what, it's very hard to read, and I don't get all that. But when you get down to it, really what this is saying is, the public service can do a lot better. It can do a lot better, and it can also do a lot better in terms of, in terms of the service. So when you go in and you're looking for information around travel accommodation, you should know that you have the same standard of service than in non-travel. When you go in terms of access, in terms of education or justice, that you know you're going to get a high quality service. So I think that's what this is about. It's not that you would have a lesser service, but you'd have a high quality service, and that there has to be checks and balances. What I mean by checks and balances, there has to be transparency, there has to be accountability, and there has to be a level of reporting back to the very community that those services apply to. So just moving it forward a little bit, there was just some key recommendations. I'm not going to go into it because I know Becca's going to cover that. But again, some of the actions in here, the recommendations, they're not entirely new. It's not that somebody's coming out with something entirely new. They're not new. So the quality proofing was an area in terms of legislation, and I think quality proofing in terms of legislation should always be scrutinised. So it should be scrutinised in terms of equality and how certain legislation, if brought in place, could have a detrimental impact or effect on a particular group. Now, it mightn't be intentional, but the other side of that, it could be. So, for example, if there is quality proofing for the criminal trespass legislation, which really criminalised travellers overnight, you might say that if you scrutinise that within the Dáil or through the Seanad, you might come back and say, you know what, this is actually detrimental to a particular cohort group in Ireland, and therefore we really need to rethink this and look at the implications of what we're introducing, rather than introducing legislation that actually would discriminate against the very community that is protected under the equal status legislation. So I think that's really, really important. I think the other area then is really, really important is that, and this has come from the report and the interviews and the community themselves, is that when you're front line and you're working front line and you're either a desk or you're a public servant, regardless, but you're going to be coming in contact with certain groups, specifically travellers. Like, there is an onus and responsibility and ensuring that people do have or undertaken anti-racist training, that you do undertake cultural competency training. Now, anti-racism training is separate from cultural competency. So somebody can be, do anti-racism training, but they mightn't have any idea about the very group you're working with. So cultural is about understanding the community that you're working with. And that is led by the community. It's not led by anybody else. I'm sure the community are well capable and have been for decades to help inform others in terms of their culture, and they're well equipped to do that. So I would be advocating and supporting those actions. And I know it's already happening. There's already initiatives in place. It's really about restating that and seeing how that can be standardised and how that can be improved and how that can be led nationally. So I think that's really important. So, and the key part of this is not about people just saying, you know what, I think it's a good idea, it's in the report, let's do it. We're saying it should be compulsory. And what we mean by that is, you must undertake the training. It's not, I'm not in or not out. I like the training, I'll do it, or I don't. It's compulsory, and therefore it gives confidence to the very community that you're serving. Doesn't mean you're an expert. Doesn't mean somehow that you're overnight that you know all about travellers and their culture, or that you're anti-racist. Absolutely not. It means that you're doing what's called ongoing professional development and training that enhances the capacity and capability in terms of working with the very community that have already been excluded, marginalised and discriminated. And the last thing that we want is go into the public service and feel that they're further being discriminated against. And my final point, glad to note, it feels like I'm a kind of lecturing here, but I'm not. But if there's an opening, give me a shout. I hear it pays well. But just in terms of the National Traveller Roma Inclusion Strategy, it is really, again, it's really important that in terms of development and the new strategy, which will come into place, probably either at the end of this year or at the beginning of 2024, it is important that strategy is one, equality proofed, but also that it also comes under the public sector duty. That there's an obligation in terms of the National Travel and Strategic Plan. And I say that because all those policies that will be developed are also going to be directly impacting on travellers. And the very people that I meet in key decision makers have never undergone training, nor are they aware in some ways of the public sector duty and their obligations. So I'm just going to conclude it, because I know there's other speakers, but just to finally say that I think it's not just only a start, but I think it's actually a significant step in terms of a local and national level. And I'll talk to the North Cork Travellers about how we can support the national element of this. And I'm sure that there are really strong components. So with that, I'm delighted to officially launch it, if that's what you do. I'm delighted to officially launch the report, and I want to commend everybody who is involved and who participated. And I'm not sure if this report could actually materialise if the travellers in this room weren't part of it. So I just want to give you a round of applause and acknowledge that.